Hello, I'm Harry Riley. Welcome to Harry's Tales. These are a collection of mystery and ghost stories. I enjoyed writing them and hope you enjoy them too. The Ghost Ship by Harry Riley. This story is fiction and resemblance to anyone living or dead is coincidental. The year was 1748, and although he didn't know it yet, this was to be his last voyage. He was homeward bound for England. Captain James, Damnation Wallace, gazed up at the menacing clouds as they scudded about the heavens and shuddered. There was a time when bad weather was just another heavy weight piled onto his broad shoulders, to be shrugged off as just the luck of the draw, but not any more. Now he was tired, worn out and a perpetual drunkard. He felt like the old man of the sea. He thought back to the halcyon days of his childhood, when he would spend most of his free time down at the docks, sitting and watching, gazing in awe-stricken wonder at the great tea clippers, arriving and unloading their assorted cargoes. His fascination as the town's Lord Mayor would arrive with his entourage, in full regalia, to greet the slave masters with a lavish official welcome. This public dignitary would often have participation shares in the enterprise, getting rich and fat off the proceeds. James would watch fearfully as muscular black slaves were led away in chains, howling and growling in frustration, to be brutally auctioned off to their new owners. The hustle and bustle and noise as ship workers mingled with foreign merchants and visitors in their colourful costumes. His nose would be filled with the smells of rich spices, coffee, dead fish and salt water. There was the stench of the farmyard, as pigs and sheep and fowl were hoisted aboard in big nets. And then there were the accidents as unskilled dock workers came to grief and ended up dead or seriously injured by overhead flying gantries. Accidental spillages were a common sight, as precious medicines were carelessly handled. Medicines for the treatment and prevention of killer diseases, like scurvy, smallpox, cholera, yellowjack and malaria. Powders containing opium and quinine would be spilled onto the rough cobbles to be licked up by the hordes of rats and stray animals. These were the memories that flooded his brain. His mother had died when he was 14. She had been a deeply spiritual woman, clutching his arm and frantically begging him on her deathbed never ever to go to sea. She tried to discourage his interest in foreign travel, having had a premonition that he would drown aboard a ship in a storm. Deprived of a proper Christian burial, his soul wouldn't rest and would roam lost and haunting the seas forever. He'd secretly laughed at this, as the ramblings of a feeble and superstitious mother's uneducated mind. And yet he loved his mother, and tearfully gave his pledge that he would do as she asked and would become a simple worker on the land like his late father before him. Later, after the simple funeral, he realised that free of parental controls he could now do as he wished. He was utterly besotted, enchanted by the prospects of life, of adventure and excitement on the ocean wave. So he thoughtlessly broke his promise and stowed aboard the next clipper to set sail. This was the Lady of the Sea. He was soon discovered cowering under a deck tarpaulin. This led to the inauspicious start of his maritime career, aiding the cook by toiling for long hours in the ship's galley. Being a little brighter than the average sailor, he was quick to catch on, and rose steadily over the years to become mate and then to take his navigation exam for his master's ticket. His nickname of Damnation was acquired early after his promotion to mate, from his habit of using the curse damnation loudly to describe his reaction to any ill fate that befell them. He couldn't count the number of times he had crisscrossed the oceans of the world, or how many ports and women he had visited. Long, long ago, his lust for the sea and adventure had faded, and now it was just a physically demanding job like any other. The merry Louie, this grand old reliable schooner, had carried him and his crew across many troubled waters. They had fought off pirates and privateers of many nations, but she too was tired, had not seen a dry dock for many a year. The timbers were rotten, eaten right through with shipworm. The owners wouldn't pay for repairs, claimed his voyages didn't bring enough profits. To have laid her up while the hull was retimbered and tarred, and new mast fitted, would have meant laying off the crew, and theirs was a very competitive market. His hold was full of finest Jamaica rum, and he was fearful of mutiny from a drunken crew. No matter how hard you tried, you couldn't stop them breaking into the casks. He knew in his soul they would never make it home. The owners wanted a good result, an insurance payback. He'd been instructed to scuttle her in deep water and take to the jolly boat. If the crew ever got wind of this, he was done for. He'd be scuppered. They'd slice his gizzard good and true. Captain Wallace gave slurred instructions to the mate to trim the sails and double the watch for the storm that he was sure was to come. And he went below decks. God, he was so exhausted. Once his cabin door was shut behind him, he took to the bottle, his only mistress now, and eventually fell into a drunken stupor. In the middle of the night he was thrown out of his bunk as the ship gave a violent shudder and left him in a heap. This was followed by the horrendous crash of breaking timbers, and even though still drunk he thought he knew that sound. The ship had run aground. She was bedded on the rocks, aided by the remaining land, and took another gulp. A sudden silence, and then the screaming sounded from above, carrying high on the wind, a weird deathly sound of men in mortal terror. Most of his crew were non-swimmers, as was a tradition among seafarers, and their yelling told him they instinctively knew that this was the end. More rum. Soon the water would flood in. Possibly he had only seconds to live. He hadn't needed to sink the vessel. She had found her own way onto the rocks. More rum, and still more rum. He threw the empty bottle away in disgust. He had to think, and then it hit him. When he'd left the mate in charge, they were still way off any land. They must have been blown off course during the night. The storm would have whipped up a huge wave, and the ship had capsized to be dashed onto the rocks. The hazardous undersea reefs were razor sharp and had hungrily seized the rotten timbers in jaws of steel, tearing and smashing and ripping them apart in a frenzy of death and destruction. He was doomed. They had joined the millions of other shipwrecks scattered around the globe. His poor mother's prophetic dream had become reality. The hot taste of rum was mingled in his throat with the salty taste of seawater. His last breath was choked off as the real old lady of the sea claimed her prize and took him for her home. Often distressed mariners still claimed to have seen the merry Louie and to have heard her drunken captain screaming damnation as she ploughs her ghostly luminous course through the violent stormy nights. End.